Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another deep dive with us today?
Always excited to go beyond those surface level summaries, help everyone connect those dots.
Exactly. And today is especially interesting, I think. We've had a request to explore something pretty specific, the intersection of autism and narcissism.
Not just defining each one, right? It's like you've asked us to unpack why that pairing specifically can be so challenging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help us out, you've sent over an article. It's from Cheap ABA. Did I say that right? I always want to make sure.
You got it. Yep. Cheap ABA.
Okay, good. And the article is titled, The Toxic Interaction Between Autism and Narcissism. So, right there in the title, getting intense.
No beating around the bush. Gets right to the heart of it.
And that's what I appreciate about this article. It doesn't waste time. It jumps right into why autistic individuals might be more susceptible to ending up in relationships with narcissists. And, it's not just about saying, oh, autistic people are naive. It's way more nuanced than that.
Way more. The article digs into how societal misconceptions about autism, when you combine that with the unique challenges so many autistic individuals face, it creates these specific vulnerabilities that someone who isn't autistic might not experience in the same way.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. The article talks about social challenges being a big factor. I mean, that makes sense at the surface level, but how does that actually play out in real life?
Right. So many autistic individuals, not everyone, but many, they have a hard time with those subtle social cues, the kind that might signal to someone else, uh-oh, something's off here.
Those red flags.
Yes, the red flags. Someone else might pick up on them instinctively, but they might not be as obvious if you're wired differently.
So it's almost like, and this is true for anyone really, but that narcissistic charm offensive, which can be very convincing even to people who aren't on the spectrum, might be even more disarming for someone who's already working overtime just to decode what's socially happening.
Exactly. And on top of that, narcissists, they thrive on admiration. It's part of how they operate. So they're often really, really good, at least at first, at being charming, interesting, even coming across as empathetic. It's their way of drawing people in.
Like camouflage. They blend in until they don't need to anymore, and then
And then the mask starts to slip. And that's where I think the article's second point comes in, that human need for connection, which again is universal. But the article argues that for many neurodivergent individuals, this craving for deep, meaningful relationships, it can make them more susceptible to someone who appears, at least initially, to offer that.
oh, that's hitting me hard.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, a drowning person will reach for anything. When you're craving that connection so much, that feeling of being seen and accepted for who you are, it makes sense that you might overlook warning signs or even explain them away because you want it to work so badly.
That's such a powerful way to put it. And this is where the article gets even more interesting, because it points out that for autistic individuals, this desire for connection can be coupled with or even amplified by a deep sense of loyalty.
So even when the red flags DO start popping up, it can be even harder to walk away because of that loyalty.
Exactly. Like the article even gives an example. Imagine someone's been told their whole life they're too much, too difficult. Then this person comes along, showers them with attention, makes them feel seen and valued maybe for the first time ever. It's huge that shift.
I can't even imagine. And then to have to walk away from that, even if things go bad, it'd be so hard. Choosing between loyalty to someone who was kind, even if they're flawed, and trusting your gut that something's off.
It's this really complex situation, and the article does a good job, I think, of really showing why it's not as simple as just saying, oh, just leave. There are layers there: social conditioning, personal experiences, someone's emotional needs.
Absolutely. And the article doesn't shy away from that complexity. And speaking of complexity, it also talks about how difficulty setting boundaries can be a major, major factor here.
Absolutely. It all ties back to those social and communication challenges we talked about earlier. It's like, imagine on top of everything else, you're navigating a world not built for your communication style, and then on top of that, you're constantly being told you're too sensitive when you do try to express a need.
It's like trying to speak a language where the rules keep changing no matter what you do and you can't get it right.
Yes, exactly. And it's exhausting and can be so damaging to someone's self-worth over time.
Which leads us to, I'm looking at the article here, that fourth vulnerability highlights low self-esteem. And this is something, sadly, that I think a lot of autistic people can relate to, even if they don't want to admit it.
Oh, absolutely. Dealing with so much stigma, misunderstanding from society, it can chip away at anyone.
And narcissists, they're really good at sensing those insecurities and using them to their advantage.
Like sharks smelling blood in the water, honestly. And it might seem counterintuitive at first because they might start by showering the person with praise, making them feel special.
But then over time, it becomes clear that the praise is conditional, right?
Yeah.
Like it's only given when the person is meeting the narcissist's need.
100%. It's less about genuine care and more about control.
So I think what we've done here, and what I really appreciate about this article, is it lays the groundwork. We're understanding the why behind this dynamic, the vulnerabilities that might make someone more susceptible.
Right. It's not about placing blame, but about understanding.
Exactly. But now let's get into the how. What are some of the specific tactics narcissists use that might be especially effective in this context? That's where I think things get really eye-opening and honestly kind of scary. Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to unpack some of those specific tactics, those things narcissists do that might be effective against, specifically, someone on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used that word tactics because it is often intentional.
Oh, totally. Even if they're not conscious of it, it's like their actions serve a purpose.
Exactly. And one that article mentions that I think is so crucial to understand in this context is gaslighting.
Right, and it's one thing to read that word like, okay, gaslighting, but it's another to really get how insidious it can be.
Oh, absolutely, especially for someone on the spectrum.
So for our listeners who maybe haven't heard that term or don't quite get it, how would you explain gaslighting?
It's about messing with your grip on reality. Like, imagine already struggling to interpret social cues, and then on top of that, you have someone who's constantly twisting events, denying your experiences.
Making you doubt your own sanity, basically.
Making you question what you saw, what you felt.
Which, if you're already wired to rely on logic, on direct communication, that has to be extra disorienting, right?
Exactly. And it can be so subtle at first, which is the dangerous part. Like a misplaced item that you know you left somewhere, but suddenly you must have imagined it, or being told you misunderstood a whole conversation.
Oh, I've been there. It's like the rug's constantly being pulled out from under you. You can't get stable.
Exactly that feeling. And over time, it chips away at your confidence, your own perception.
So no wonder the article really highlights this as like a major red flag.
Huge. Because if you don't trust your own senses, who do you trust?
Right. You become dependent on the person who's manipulating you.
It's a vicious cycle, for sure.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening to this and it's clicking. They're recognizing these patterns, maybe in their own life, maybe someone they love. What can you do about it? Because the article talks about educating yourself about narcissism, but where do you even start? It's like, okay, Google it. Read a book.
Right, and there's tons of information out there, which can be overwhelming. I think it's less about memorizing, like, a checklist of traits, and more about connecting those traits to real-life behaviors.
So how does this person ACT, not just what label do we slap on them?
That's it. Because learning to spot a narcissist, it's meaningless if you don't know how to protect yourself, right?
Totally, totally. So what's the next step then? If it's not enough to just be able to say, oh, that person's a narcissist, what then?
Well, the article really emphasizes self-awareness in these situations, which I think is so key.
Knowing yourself as much as you're trying to know the other person.
Yes. For example, if you know you have a tendency to people pleaser or you hate conflict, avoid it at all costs. Well, a narcissist is going to pick up on that. They're very perceptive in that way. So being aware of those tendencies in yourself, that's step one.
It's like knowing your weak spots so you can protect them better.
Exactly. And that ties into setting boundaries, which we touched on earlier, which I know is easier said than done, especially if you've been conditioned to put everyone else's needs before your own.
So how do you do that? Like practically, where do you start if you've never felt allowed to have boundaries?
It's a process. It really is. It takes practice. But a good place to start is just identifying, okay, what are your non-negotiables? The values you hold dear that you're not willing to compromise on no matter what.
So it's almost like reclaiming those values if you've had them dismissed or minimized for a long time.
Oh, 100%. And once you know what those are, those non-negotiables, then you can start setting boundaries around them. Like if honesty is huge EE for you, but the other person is constantly lying, manipulating, well, that's a boundary being crossed right there.
But what if, and this is the part I always struggle with, what if they guilt trip you? Make you feel bad for having those boundaries in the first place? Because narcissists are not known for respecting other people's limits, you know?
That is so real. And it's tough. I won't sugarcoat it. That's where it becomes even more important to like stand firm, to remind yourself their reaction to your boundary, that is about them, not about you.
Oh, that's good. I need to write that down.
Right. It's a reframe. But it's hard, especially if you've been in this dynamic for a long time where you've been trained to doubt yourself.
Which is why I'm looking at the article here. It also talks about seeking professional support, like actually talking to a therapist.
Yes. And I think it's important to find one who understands both autism and narcissistic abuse, because those are two very specific areas of expertise.
Like you wouldn't go to a foot doctor for heart surgery, right?
Exactly. You need someone who gets it.
Yeah.
And it can help you unpack all these dynamics, come up with coping mechanisms that work for you.
It's like having a guide in a really, really tricky jungle, you know?
Mhm.
And not just individual therapy either, right? The article also stresses, like, the importance of your support network, your friends, your family.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Mm.
Having those people in your corner who can offer a different perspective, who can validate your experiences when you're doubting yourself, it makes all the difference.
It's like those friends who will be like, what I'm hearing is, have you thought about it this way? Just that reality check can be so grounding.
Totally. And that actually ties into another point the article makes that I wanted to bring up, learning to trust your gut instinct.
Which so many of us are taught to ignore, right? Especially if you're someone who's a people pleaser.
Absolutely. But those instincts are there for a reason. Like, even if you can't put your finger on what's wrong, if something feels O off F, it probably is.
It's about reclaiming that inner compass.
Yes. That's a great way to put it. Your own sense of knowing what's right for you.
Okay, so we've talked about educating ourselves, setting boundaries, getting support, trusting our gut, all super important. But there's this other layer the article touches on that I think is really interesting. It's about how we as a society can create an environment that's more inclusive and understanding for neurodivergent individuals in the first place. Because ultimately, preventing this kind of toxicity, it starts with promoting the opposite, right?
That's exactly it.
Promoting empathy, understanding, genuine connection, the things narcissists feed off of.
It's like the antidote to that toxicity, isn't it?
Right. And the article even makes this point. It's like, if those challenges, like with social cues and communication, if that can make someone more susceptible to these dynamics in the first place, maybe it's not just about teaching autistic individuals how to navigate a world that wasn't built for them.
Oh, I like where you're going with this. You're saying it's about changing the world itself.
Yes. Like, what if we focused more on making it more inclusive, more understanding for everyone, regardless of neurodiversity?
Making it so people don't have to constantly mask and camouflage who they are just to get by.
Exactly. So it's not just about being careful in romantic relationships. It's about recognizing these patterns everywhere.
Oh, 100%. Families, friendships, workplaces, even just like casual encounters.
Because those dynamics, that power imbalance, it can happen anywhere.
And think about it, if you're someone who struggles with those social cues, or you've been conditioned to be a people pleaser, it's like you're vulnerable in a NY setting where someone might pick up on that and exploit it.
So it's almost like double the awareness is needed, not just for your own sake, but to help protect others who might be more vulnerable in those situations.
Absolutely. And that might mean having some tough conversations, like setting those firm boundaries with family members we talked about, maybe reconsidering certain friendships that aren't healthy.
It's not easy, but I'm hearing you say it's worth it.
100%. Because life's too short to surround yourself with people who drain you, who diminish you. You deserve relationships that uplift you, that empower you to be your best self.
You've just reminded me of that quote. I think it's Maya Angelou. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. And I think it applies here because we have to trust our gut. And sometimes that means walking away, even when it's hard, even when it hurts.
It's about knowing your worth.
Yes. And that, to me, that's the most hopeful takeaway from all of this. Because it is hopeful, right? Like the article itself, it ends on this note of possibility, saying maybe, just maybe, preventing this toxicity starts with promoting empathy, understanding, genuine connection, all those things we've been talking about.
And I have to believe that's true.
Me too.
Yeah.
It has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my final question for you, for listeners to think about, is can we actually create that kind of world? A world where those things are valued, where differences are seen as strengths, not deficits. What do you think?
I have to believe we can. It starts with each of us, like in our own little corners of the world, challenging our biases, educating ourselves, speaking up for what's right.
It's a collective effort.
It is. But one I think is so, so worth it. Because imagine like a world where everyone feels safe to be their authentic selves, where those differences are celebrated. That's a world I want to live in.
Me too. A world where that kind of toxicity doesn't stand a chance. And on that note, that inspiring note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We covered a lot today. Really got into the nitty-gritty of autism and narcissism, why that pairing can be so tough. But most importantly, I think we highlighted those empowering steps we can all take to build healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
Exactly. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand these dynamics, the better equipped we are, not just for ourselves, but to support our loved ones too.
If you're looking for more resources on this, we'll have links to everything we talked about today on our website, plus some bonus stuff too, articles, organizations that can help. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing in that brighter, more connected future.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.